thank Dr. Downing for her work with me, for her insightful feedback and advice, for pushing me to get the best out of this project. And a lot of you know I've been working remotely, and so handling kind of whatever trickiness comes with email communication. So, like Dr. Downing said, my interest was in the cultural success of Alice and Oz, and a prominent place that these stories hold in society today. So when I was in Oxford, you can't go into a souvenir shop without seeing a Mad Hatter tea set, or there's even this street performing man riding on a stationary bicycle with the White Rabbit costume on. And in New York City, in Central Park, Alice has been immortalized by that very famous statue of Alice in Wonderland based on the original John Tenniel illustrations. And Oz, of course, has been commemorated famously with the 1939 MGM film, and again with the hit Broadway show Wicked, and even this past year with the remake of The Wiz, which celebrates the Black community as an American subculture. So the question that I wanted to answer was just looking at how these stories are being told and retold, but the fact that the texts themselves have been neglected or kind of lost, and I wanted to know why. So my argument in my paper is that the lost little heroines of modern fairy tale literature, which is a genre in which these two authors are writing, namely Alice and Dorothy, indirectly portray prototypes for the ideal human by inadvertently promoting 19th century Western ideologies of childhood and femininity. So in other words, the nature of the modern fairy tale and the inclusion of these lost little girls in Alice and Oz inherently promotes British and American ideologies of childhood and femininity, whether the author is aware of this or not. So in the beginning of my essay, I kind of outlined what I'm talking about with the modern fairy tale. It's significant to note what J.R.R. Tolkien calls relegation to the nursery of the modern fairy tale in the 19th century, where, as many of us may know, fairy tale literature was not originally intended for children. If you look at the fairy stories of Grimm or Anderson, they're very gruesome, and they weren't directed towards children. And so in the 19th century, by limiting the audience to children, it also kind of averted the eyes of critics, or at least delayed this critical analysis of these works. So essentially, though, today I hope to focus largely on the place of these texts, not in the fairy tale canon, but in children's literature. And by looking at the historical context of these works and their cultural embeddedness. So looking back to Victorian views of femininity in childhood and contrasting that with American views of femininity in childhood, and how these cultural ideologies are manifest in these texts. So essentially, I hope to establish a critical understanding of these works so that we may appreciate their presence in today's culture. And so I want to begin by looking at Alice in the modern fairy tale as a reaction against the didactic children's literature of the 18th century. So beginning specifically in Victorian England with books like Alice, children's literature mimicked traditions of the past only mockingly or satirically. Indeed, where authors of the fairy tale hoped to cling to the traditions and status of narrative literature of the past, those of the modern fairy tale sought to dissociate themselves from their children's literature predecessors. Patricia Deemers and Gordon Moyles provide perhaps the best outline of this revolution in their anthology of children's literature, From Instruction to Delight, which traces the progression of the fiction books of English childhood up to the time of Lewis Carroll. 18th century children's stories, they say, often had one single didactic purpose, and that was to instruct children on how to behave as little adults. Scholar Jackie Wolschlager calls this a period of training for adulthood. That is to say, essentially, that childhood and adulthood were not necessarily segregated quite to the extent that they are today. One was viewed merely as the early stages of the other, and childhood had simply been considered an inexperienced version of adulthood. And British children's books of the 18th century thus functioned primarily as manuals to prepare for this adult experience. In their anthology, Deemers and Moyles include poetry samples of one of the most popular pre-Victorian children's writers, Isaac Watts, to demonstrate this concept. Here, the first stanza of Watts's poem, Against Idleness and Mischief, presents the image of a busy bee in hopes that children might emulate her diligence. He writes, "How doth the little busy bee improve each shining hour, and gather honey all the day from every opening flower." To authors like Lewis Carroll, however, this training of miniature adults for lives of hard work and maintained social etiquette is ridiculous. Thus, his work represents the 19th century reaction to this approach. In Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Carol references Watts's didactic poem in a parody which promotes vanity and luxury in opposition to the little bee's hard work. How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale? Despite this rebellion against instruction, however, the Victorian writer, like the American bomb after him, seems to be unaware of the concept that 20th century scholar Mary B. Jackson acknowledges as the propagandistic nature of children's literature. And she writes that whether subtly or blatantly, children's books are largely propagandistic in nature, and they are tools to program the young to engineer conformity to the prevailing cultural values. That is, the efforts of Carroll and his successors react against writers like Watts and their aim to delight. The very fact that they write for children implies that they instruct by default. Like the explicitly didactic author, the author of modern children's literature still teaches the child how to function in society, though the ultimate lesson in this case is delaying maturation, not speeding it up. The Victorian inclusion of far-off lands and their overall goal to entertain make this instruction all the more subtle. For instance, Carroll may boast, like Baum does of Oz, that the Alice books were written for no other purpose than to amuse children by parodying their lessons, but the historian or critic can observe how he inadvertently perpetuated his own cultural values in his work. For example, it may be argued that the character of Alice promotes the patriarchal ideology of the Victorians. That is, the moral and submissive characteristics of Alice also reflect the ideal subdued woman of the 19th century England. Lost in the playful wordplay and captivating adventures of the Alice books, few readers, child or adult, would venture to question or second-guess the behavior of the little heroine. This denial of didacticism does not diminish their ideological function then, but rather makes it all the more subtle and therefore more powerful. So now I want to talk about the actual ideologies that they so subtly promote, beginning with childhood in Alice and answering kind of the question of why would Carroll choose to write about a little girl. So Lewis Carroll, as Dr. Downing mentioned, was the pseudonym of the popular and beloved Victorian storyteller who wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Born Charles Lutwidge Dodgson to a large family in England, the now world-renowned writer began as a student of mathematics at Christ Church, Oxford. He later became a Don and established a famous friendship with the Dean, Henry Little, who had 3 young daughters, Lorena, Alice, and Edith. Dodgson often visited these girls and entertained them with nonsense stories, which would eventually flower into the Alice books. He expressed particular fondness for the second oldest girl, Alice Little, and maintained a close relationship with her for the rest of his life. Many readers today who are encountering Carroll's biography for the first time are often appalled by just how close this friendship was. Fairly intimate letters were exchanged between them, and Dodgson, an amateur, though talented up-and-coming photographer, often photographed young Alice nude or in sultry poses. Though no sound evidence truly exists suggesting that Dodgson and Alice had sexual relations, their relationship to the modern audience often appears dangerously too close for comfort, and many new readers mistake the bachelor's adoring interest for pedophilia. A more accurate understanding of Dodgson's doting behavior and affections, however, would recognize that this was a fairly normal Victorian relationship. Though this may not necessarily reduce its pedophilic appearance, it may, however, shed some light on Carroll's situation. In fact, even the most respectable scholars of the era, men like John Ruskin, were also often found in this setting of being left alone with young girls. Ruskin undoubtedly exhibits the most notorious of these relationships. Another Oxonian, who ironically also served as Alice Little's drawing tutor, Ruskin famously fell in love with a pretty little 9-year-old girl named Rose. Intrigued by her innocence and purity, namely her virginity, Ruskin courted Rose as a sexless lover while his wife, quote, languished as a virgin because her husband declined sexual involvement. If they did not explicitly demonstrate this intense though repressed sexual interest in children, as in this case, then many men like Ruskin, for example Thomas Carlyle and J.M. Barrie, denied their wives sex for this belief in the virgin little girl as the obvious ideal. Though the unmarried Dodgson may or may not have been counted among these men who shared the same pedophilic fantasy, his work certainly exudes this societal preference. Some critics have perhaps overambitiously even attributed many images in Alice to represent symbols of sexuality and pedophilic desire. For example, symbols like falling down the rabbit hole or fitting keys into a lock to signify coitus, or the appearance of phallic symbols in the form of Alice's growing and shrinking neck. Where these assertions are not completely far-fetched, seeing as the entire appeal of these little girls lay in their virginity and sexual purity, it seems unlikely that Carroll should mar these qualities in his primary audience by littering his story with hidden sex symbols. Nevertheless, this Victorian attraction to little girls is little more than a side effect of the combined British ideologies of childhood and femininity. So now that we know children are important, there's still the question of, beyond Alice Little's obvious influence, why should the child be female in these stories? And so Alice's femininity is also defined by her Victorian setting. In fact, the concept of using a heroine in literature to portray a societal ideal was not uncommon at this time. John Ruskin, again, for instance, acknowledges this value by comparing the heroines and heroes of Shakespeare, asserting that while Shakespeare's heroes are often deeply flawed characters, the poet's women are perfect and exactly what they ought to be. He writes that there is hardly a play that has not a perfect woman in it, steadfast in grave hope and errorless purpose. They are all faultless, conceived in the highest heroic type of humanity. Victorian writer Sarah Stickney Ellis makes a similar point when she says that all the female characters that are held up to universal admiration have been women who were dignified with the majesty of moral greatness. According to the Victorians, then, the kind, nurturing, composed woman is the ideal societal figure. This notion, of course, may harmonize with the simultaneous Victorian obsession with the child. Thus, Alice, as both child and female, functions as a heroine even more perfect than Shakespeare's heroines. In Carroll's work specifically, we might note that Wonderland is a world primarily dominated by women. The rulers of Wonderland take form in the cross and antagonistic Queen of Hearts and a loud, ugly Duchess, constantly in an irritated or disturbed disposition. Though men are present in Wonderland, they are weak in power and dominance compared to the women. The King of Hearts, for instance, has no actual kingly power, but instead is nervously squished under the thumb of his queen. In Alice's experience in Wonderland, she is constantly being told what to do and how to behave by these overpowering women. For example, in a croquet game with a certain Queen of Hearts, who beheads anyone who happens to offend her. Still, despite Alice's confusion in Wonderland, she consistently maintains her feminine virtues of politeness, kindness, and self-control. For example, during croquet, when asked how do you like the Queen, Alice begins by saying, not at all, she's so extremely, and then upon the approach of the Queen behind her, redirects her answer to, likely to win that it's hardly worth finishing the game. By Victorian standards, then, we might conclude that the preferred citizen is the child, and that the ideal child is female. In this setting, however, this ideal image of society, the little girl, is lost in a world of antagonism and rules of social behavior. The only way for Alice to free herself from her entrapment in this land of lessons and ridiculous rules is to wake up to her sister assuring her that she had only dreamt it. That is, even upon emerging from this land of submission and correction, the Victorian little girl is still denied the reality of its ridiculousness. Alice exits from Wonderland into a reality which antagonistically beats their set of cultural values associated with femininity and childhood into her in very much the same way. And the American child, by contrast, we can see that Dorothy's experience in Oz upholds very American standards of childhood and femininity, even though plot lines may have some crossover. Unlike Carroll's relationship with Alice Little, research reveals little evidence which indicates that L. Frank Baum knew a little girl named Dorothy. Some, like Baum biographer Rebecca Longcrane, suggest that in an era with extremely high infant mortality rates, Baum named his heroine after his baby niece, who tragically passed in infancy. For Baum, who worked various jobs as an actor, playwright, businessman, and traveling salesman, writing and his inclusion of heroines was largely a commercial endeavor. The child, who had essentially been regarded as even a national symbol for Carroll and his contemporary Victorians, seemed not to strike the Americans with the same intense emotions or adorations. For the Americans, rather than function as the object of strong romantic or even sexual attraction, the child seemed more to serve as a vessel for commercialism. That is arguably one of the biggest reasons Americans like Baum were so interested in the Alice books, were because of their success. This attraction to success may perhaps reflect the ideas of American capitalism and the emphasis on individual success versus the Victorian emphasis on socialism and communal success. For instance, to the American, the very appeal of the children's fairy tale may have been the fact that children's books were one of the most profitable parts of the Victorian publishing industry and were so popular and successful in England that the Americans felt excluded from Western culture for not having their own fairy tale tradition. Indeed, even as Oz critic Michael Patrick Hearn points out, the American book trade's response to Lewis Carroll's death in 1898 was to put out books of book adulation or imitation. Thus, the spirit of Oz is slightly different from that of Wonderland in that, to some extent, it is essentially only an Americanized version of Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. These American values may present themselves even in the fact that, as a result of the large immediate success of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, Baum appeased the demands of his child fans by continuing on to write 13 sequels to the Oz stories. He also was highly involved in the transfer of his story from text to the stage and eventually to the screen. By comparison, though Carroll did try his hand at one other children's series, Sylvie and Bruno, despite high demand, he only produced one sequel to his original Alice, though he did also encourage the theatrical production of Alice on stage. Thus, the American attention to the child, for the most part, had descended from the Victorian worship of the child, and the representation of children in fairy tale literature inadvertently possesses a commercial function reflective of consumer society. Simply put, the author's very choice to set Oz to writing is a business decision. Children buy, or at least their parents do, and fairy tale sells. Despite similarity in concept, Dorothy's journey as female through Oz, upon close analysis, is remarkably different from Alice's experience in Wonderland. Like Wonderland, however, Oz contains very few strong male characters. In fact, critic Russell B. Nye points out that even the few boys in Oz are girls' boys, drawn as little girls assume boys should be. Indeed, it would seem that the males in Oz are more in need of Dorothy's help than she is of theirs. Even the wizard is a hoax who has no actual power of his own to compete with the witches of Oz. Nye asserts that Baum maintains the feminine ideal of childhood by his exclusion of Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn-like characters who embody the mischievous and energetic nature of boyhood. The majority of characters which Dorothy encounters, male and female, do not constantly remind her of her hierarchical status, as the monarchs of Wonderland do, but rather serve as helpful companions, gaily helping her along towards her ultimate journey homeward. Characters like the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodsman, and the Cowardly Lion are not rude or condescending as the Caterpillar is to Alice, but rather helpful and supportive of Dorothy and her quest. In the end, Dorothy is finally able to return home by her own power, which she possessed all along and simply been unaware, flicking her heels together 3 times. Unlike Alice, who is herself powerless to escape Wonderland and ridiculous, nonsensical social rules, Dorothy is not only self-sufficient and able to exit Oz on her own decision, but she is even joined along the way by at least 3 constant male companions. Thus, Lost Little Dorothy reflects the early stages of the self-empowered female of the American feminist movement, who autonomously finds her own way home. Perhaps one of the most influential female figures in Baum's life and fiction was his mother-in-law, Matilda Gage. Mrs. Gage was a bright, successful early feminist leader of the late 19th century. A prominent suffragette, Matilda Gage collaborated with famous female leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony during the American women's rights movement. Though there seems to be some discrepancy among critics regarding what exactly Baum's feelings towards his in-laws were, most seem to agree that he spent significant time with her. Most critics also agree that Matilda Gage can most likely be credited as the force that encouraged Baum to pen and publish his Oz stories. Adventuresome heroines, strong female characters, and traces of feminism certainly have their place in Oz, but whether these elements promote the suffragette or satirically poke fun at her seems up for debate. Critic Martin Gardner matter-of-factly points out that explains that Baum's mother-in-law was a prominent feminist, a fact that may help explain his dislike of the new women. Even the Oz books contain many sly digs at the suffragettes, and one book, The Land of Oz, is one long satire on the movement. Gardner believes that these female rulers of Oz function as dictators, and that the husbands of Oz are forced to take over all the former duties of their wives. By contrast, Baum biographer Rebecca Longcrane suggests that the presence of these strong female characters in Oz instead praise the feminist movements and support suffragettes. She even cites a recorded quotation from Baum speaking fondly of his mother-in-law. She is undoubtedly one of the most remarkable women of her age, possessed of the highest literary ability, the brightest thoughts, the clearest and most scholarly oratory, the most varied research, and intelligent and diversified pen of any public woman in the past 20 years. Where Gardner asserts that these figures are satirical, Longcrane certainly seems to provide sound evidence that they are genuine praises of his mother-in-law's cause, though when assessing authorial intention, no reader can truly be certain. Readers often are unsure of what to make of the book's female heroine, along with the dominating forces of powerful witches in Oz, for example, the famous Glinda and the Wicked Witch of the West being the most remembered of these. Regardless of what Baum intended to communicate by including these characters, however, the ongoing feminist movement surrounding him clearly permeated his work in the form of female characters. The fact that Baum chose to focus his fairy tale on the adventures of one little girl, though as far as the historian knows, he personally knew no little girls on which to base his character, may not only be a blatant nod to Alice, but also to the challenging ideologies of American womanhood and feminism. Now I'll take any questions or suggestions if you have any.
I'd be curious to know about the gap that you sort of brought to mind for me as someone who spends most of their time in literature before 1800. Because yes, there's very little interest in children. And I'm wondering, where's the turn? What is it? What happens? I mean, one of the things I'm wondering is it possible there's a connection in education? I mean, even since you brought Shakespeare up, right? I mean, Shakespeare is probably, by the time he is 10, has felicity in Latin enough that he's been reading Ovid's Metamorphoses. He's reading the Aeneid, right? I mean, children were given adult literature to cut their teeth on, to learn the language, and this continues up through the 18th century as Latin and Greek continue to be basic to the education of boys. Now, I don't know, see, women could be a different story, but even in women's fiction, right up to Jane Austen, there's not much interest at all in children. And the interest, the little bit of interest you see in a writer like Henry Fielding or Lawrence Stern isn't really in the child. It's just, you might be talking about Tristram in his youth, but the focus is on his father's opinions, his own. I mean, so what happens? Did you come across anything that identifies what makes that turn that now we're actually going to be interested in children and what they experience, and in a sense, the child's psychology almost? And I'm just curious. This is like an open question.
No, and I would have to look further into it because it's difficult to isolate to kind of a particular moment where that happened. I think that's kind of just generally what I've always been interested to be kind of a Victorian value. I just lost my train of thought, but I would have to look into finding a specific moment that triggered that. And even, I guess what I was studying mostly for mine is kind of the merge of children's literature with fairy tale, because that wasn't seen before either. And I know that even in, this isn't just in literature, it's kind of across the arts too. The child really comes out as being different from this little adult. I was reading a scholar that was talking about how portraiture changes around this time too. Even children that were once portrayed in these poses, these very adult poses and adult garb, but just kind of miniature looking. And then all of a sudden he talks about Millet's portrait of I don't know if you're familiar with Millet's portrait on the soap advertisement of this little boy. I think it's his grandson posing. And then all of a sudden you see this baby face, these rosy cheeks and these big wide eyes, and you really see a child in their natural habitat, really, I guess, and natural poses. And so maybe in the art world, at least in that, there's kind of that emphasis on portraying like reality as we see it, and preserving that innocence of childhood, which kind of becomes more valuable. I don't know if that really answers your question. That's something I would have to look more into. But
for you, just generated curiosity for me as to why do things go the direction they go.
Karin, it suddenly strikes me. I wonder if this was the fascination Carol had in taking nude photographs of these little girls. It's almost to establish the distinction. These aren't just little mini adults.
right.
So it strikes us as prurient, but for him, it was almost proof that this is a separate category of human being. To answer Samuel's question, I think the transitional moment is the publication of their ballads, where Wordsworth is suddenly celebrating the child, and where children have more astute perceptions of life than adults do. And of course, the Victorians were exceedingly influenced by Wordsworth.
And I'm working this out in my paper, but the same scholar that brings up Millet speaks of kind of the different views of John Locke looking at children as kind of a tabula rasa, informing children on how to function in society versus Rousseau who thinks that children shouldn't even be reading books because we should be preserving that innocence for them. And so those characters kind of show up in this as well, I think, in this discussion.
This is often why children's are orphans too, right? Is because you have to completely remove them from that parental influence, so we can see them sort of in their as noble savages in some way, right? And I don't know what Alice's situation is in terms of her home life. What is her?
Well, we don't really know, and that's the really interesting thing about these characters is there's kind of a malleability to them, and that really we don't really know a specific age. We know Alice has a sister. We know Dorothy has an aunt and uncle. We can kind of just feed whatever cultural ideology we want to into that character, and because it's going to children and it's so part of popular culture too. It's not. It's all the more subtle in that. So, yeah, for Alice, we don't really know.
So you mentioned
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can you speak a little louder?
how do you reconcile this idea of saying that story components that happens later, the fact that the people in the story are the witches, and how we seem to preserve that in the play with story and how to reconcile.
That we preserve the American feminism in Wicked, is that what you're saying?
No, just do you see a contradiction there? I'm just wondering what your reading of that is. So we're saying that.
No, I want it.
That so many of the adult women are horrid in these things, right?
Oh, well, yeah, but even the premise of Wicked is that she's not actually wicked. It's this whole kind of, we're allowed this kind of empathetic insight to her character, and with Dorothy, are you talking about Dorothy specifically, or are you talking about the witches in Oz? Because the witches, the reason that they're witches too is Baum sets out to create the American fairy tale. So he's really done his research. So the witches that you see in Oz kind of obey the laws of fairy tale tradition. And just because they're kind of popular characters in that tradition, which I believe is probably why he made that choice. But you have good witches and bad witches in those, and I don't think there's really, I don't know if that necessarily affects what I'm trying to say so much. Sorry. Any questions?
You spoke about the rise of fairy tales as children's literature, the rise of children's literature itself. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about when and how children's literature becomes the focus of scholarly attention for who are reading it. What timeline does that follow, and does that coincide with some of your feminist readings of these texts?
That would be good to look into because I don't know necessarily the specific history of that. But I do know there is a critic, Martin Gardner, who I mentioned, who works with both texts. And what was really interesting I found was with him, he said that, I think the quote is, the time has passed when a child under 15, even in England, can enjoy Alice with the same delight, meaning that those books are dead to the child and only critics can really read them. But he says that the Oz books will, because they access the universal child, will live on. So, which is interesting because I think he's writing in 50s maybe, so he was reading Oz as a child essentially. So even his criticism of Alice and praise of Oz is culturally conditioned. So I'm not sure exactly when it started that they got, these works specifically, I could probably trace back the criticism of children's literature, but these works I'm trying to say are different from children's literature preceding specifically. So I guess I would have to look at the history of these works specifically. Is that answer? Any other questions? Thank you.